Ukrainian air defenses have been fighting off renewed attacks on Kyiv and other regional cities on Thursday. No casualties were reported as a result of the strikes that followed accusations from Moscow that Ukraine forces were responsible for an alleged drone attack on the Kremlin aimed at assassinating Vladimir Putin. Ukraine denies involvement in the incident.
This footage, circulating on Russian Telegram channels, shows the alleged overnight attack and smoke rising above the main Kremlin palace. There has been no independent verification of this footage, but Russia accuses Ukraine of trying to assassinate Putin. Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelenskyy denied any involvement in the alleged incident.
We don't attack Putin or Moscow. We fight on our territory. We are defending our villages and cities. We don't have, enough weapon for this. That's why we don't use it anywhere. For us, that is the deficit. We can't spend it. And we didn't attack Putin. We leave it to tribunal.
In Washington, U.S. Secretary of State Antony Blinken cast doubt on the Kremlin's allegations.
These are decisions for Ukraine. I've seen the reports. I can't in any way validate them. We simply don't know. Second, I would take anything coming out of the Kremlin with a very large shaker of salt. So let's see. We'll see what the facts are. And it's really hard to comment or speculate on this without really knowing what the facts are.
Moscow has threatened to retaliate against Ukraine, making residents of Kyiv worried for their safety.
They might try attacking strategic objects where decisions are made in Kyiv. They might shell us with missiles again. We need to remain in safety and take care of ourselves and our loved ones.
For now, Putin remains safe. Moscow announced that he will take part in a scheduled World War II Victory Day parade on Red Square next week.
And we have team coverage. I am joined by my colleague, DW Bureau Chief in Riga, Yuri Rashchedo, and by correspondent Nick Connolly, who is in Kyiv. Welcome to both of you. Yuri, I'll begin with you. Tell us a little bit more about the reaction within Russia from the government and among the general population to the Kremlin's claims of a drone attack.
Well, Sarah, the Kremlin views this as a planned act of terrorism and an attempt on President Putin's life carried out just a few days before Victory Day, the May 9 parade, which is, we have to keep in mind, one of the most important days, if not the most important day in Russia, and in which, or at which also foreign guests expected to be present. Moscow reserves the right to retaliate when and where it sees fit, it's said. The Kremlin spokesman Peskov didn't specify what exactly this means, but some other harsh official reactions could probably give some clarity or sense. Former Prime Minister and President Medvedev demanded, quote, the physical removal of Ukrainian President Zelenskyy. A State Duma deputy from Russia-annexed Crimea called even for a missile strike on Zelenskyy's residence. State Duma Speaker Volodin called for the authorities in Kyiv to be recognized as a terrorist regime. And finally, the well-known propagandist Krasovsky wonders whether this is a reason to finally call the war a war and not the special military operation, as it's still officially called in Russia.
So that's the reaction in Russia. Nick, we heard the reaction in Ukraine. Zelenskyy strongly denying any Ukrainian involvement. What is the response now in Kyiv to Moscow's threat of retaliation?
Ordinary Ukrainians responded with a flood of memes on social media. I think there's no sense here that Ukrainians are kind of shockable. Short of nuclear weapons, Russia doesn't really have any new tricks up its sleeve. We've seen it all before, right at the beginning of the war, all those threats to destroy Ukraine's government institutions, to attack Zelenskyy personally. That all didn't materialize. I think what they are scared about here is if Russia manages to convince lots of countries in Europe that maybe we're a bit lukewarm about supplying Ukraine with weapons, that this is a dangerous situation, that there's a risk of kind of conflagration, escalation, and that might be used by Russia to try and kind of browbeat Western supporters of Ukraine to reducing their support, that is something they're definitely worried about here.
Yuri, if not Ukraine, what could be behind the alleged drone attack?
Well, in Russia, there are few and even cautious speculations. Of course, the symbolic power of these attacks is obvious, Sarah. It happened in the middle of Moscow, above the Kremlin, a few days before Victory Day and the military parade. Given all this symbolism, all the theories, it could have been the intelligence services, for example, themselves, Russian intelligence services themselves, who carried out these attacks. We must keep in mind that the image damage is greater than maybe any other potential secret targets. On the other hand, the question is, why did the Russian authorities immediately call the attack an assassination attempt on President Putin? Obviously, they are pursuing propaganda and possibly diplomatic goals. According to one of the UN conventions, the head of any state enjoys international protection. Even though the International Criminal Court in The Hague issued an arrest warrant for Putin, he remains the current head of state and a person under international protection. Therefore, Russia may demand to hold a meeting of the UN Security Council and adopt a resolution condemning the attack on the Kremlin.
Before we go, Nick, Russia, meantime, launching a pre-dawn attack on Kyiv for the third time in 4 days. Tell us a little bit more.
Well, the authorities here are calling it the most major attack in terms of the kinds of systems, kinds of missiles and drones sent this way. The biggest attack on Ukraine's capital since the beginning of the year. Certainly it was very, very loud. Most of the time here in the center of Kyiv, you don't hear a great deal. It all sounds pretty far away. But certainly I and lots of people I know in this part of town, in the center, woke up with a thud at about 2:30 in the morning. And certainly friends and colleagues across the city heard similarly loud noises. So the idea is that these were several strikes, attempted strikes, all of them seemingly downed by Ukrainian defense systems. But there is talk also not just of those normal Iranian drones that have become part of everyday life here, but also of ballistic missiles being used, which obviously are very hard to intercept. That seemingly did happen. And we heard what sounded like bits of debris falling to the ground afterwards, kind of sounded like bottles being thrown on the ground. So that certainly was a reminder that Russia still has a lot of these missiles. But after all, this is nothing new. And I think there is very little chance for the Russians now to try and kind of browbeat Ukrainians, because they have already thrown all this stuff at ordinary Ukrainians for the past year and several months now.
DW's Nick Connolly in Kyiv, Yuri Reshetto in Riga. Thank you so much to both of you.
Let's go now to Dr. Carrie Chavez, a political scientist from Texas Tech University and a research fellow with the Modern War Institute at West Point. And she writes about the use of military and commercial drones in the war in Ukraine. She joins us tonight from Lubbock, Texas. It's good to have you with us, Dr. Chavez. I mean, what was your reaction to this video coming that apparently shows a drone exploding over the Kremlin?
Thank you for having me on. I think that even in such a brief video, there's a lot of indications about the capacity involved in this attack that potentially might give us clues as to what's going on. I think overall, it suggests that there's about moderate capacity. There are some aspects here that appear unsophisticated, but some that appear more advanced, which means that it certainly could have been the Ukrainian army or a rogue Ukrainian actor or Russian actor of lesser capacity. The drones appear to be smaller, fixed-wing drones. I've seen some label them as makeshift, but they seem to comport with Ukraine's own UJ-22, potentially a Chinese-made drone that Ukraine possesses. And the warhead, small, and certainly a sparse explosive payload. So I think that it suggests that it might be a less sophisticated attack.
And what do we know then, or what can you tell us about Russia's drone defense capabilities? I mean, and is it possible for a drone to evade Russian radar in the heart of Moscow?
Yes, there is missile defense systems that cover Moscow. However, there are gaps. In fact, in January, Russia installed additional defense.
I mean, is it possible, let me ask you, is it possible for a drone of this size to fly from outside Russian territory? I think we're talking about what? It would be 300 miles from the Ukrainian border to Moscow. I mean, can drones make that distance under the radar?
Absolutely. It is technically feasible that a Ukrainian drone could fly from the territory of Ukraine to Moscow. The two drones that I cited just a moment ago, potentially the Chinese-made one or the Ukrainian indigenously produced one, have ranges of about 8,000 to 1,000 kilometers. So they are long endurance, longer range platforms. So it's technically feasible. And I think that's exactly why Russia has been articulating these intentions to strengthen their existing defenses. I even heard after today's attack that some are citing the installation of an invisible dome at all their strategic military and civilian locations in the near future. So it's possible. It's less likely that this was manually operated from the vicinity of Moscow. Of course, if it's not Ukrainian, then it's possibly a simpler platform that was launched in a shorter range. But all of those are possible technically.
Yeah, technically. And of course, the questions people want to know still unanswered tonight. Dr. Carrie Chavez joining us tonight from Lubbock, Texas. We appreciate your time and your valuable insight, Doctor. Thank you.
Thank you.